Have you ever noticed that some musicians seem to improve faster or just play at a higher level, even though they don't appear to practice that much more than anyone else? It's tempting to assume they're just more talented. And sure, maybe that's part of it, but what if it's because they're doing something fundamentally different in the practice room? Researchers who have actually filmed and analyzed how expert level and intermediate level performers practice, tracking not just how long they spend, but what they do, what they think about, and how they structure their time, have found that experts and less expert performers can spend the exact same amount of time practicing and still end up in very different places. The gap isn't in the hours, it's in what happens inside them. Hi, I'm Noah Kageyama. I'm a performance psychologist and Juilliard-trained violinist, and I translate research from the performance science literature into practical strategies to help you practice smarter and perform your best when it matters most. Today, I wanted to share a study that looked at 5 specific ways experts approached practice differently than less expert performers, and what that might mean for how to make the most of your practice time. It was published in 2013 by a team of researchers in the UK, and it involved 45 Gaelic football players. If you're wondering what the heck Gaelic football is, it's basically a mashup of soccer and rugby with a dash of basketball thrown in. It's the most popular sport in Ireland, and it involves, among other things, a kicking skill that researchers found very useful for measuring practice quality. They started out by dividing the athletes by skill level and then set up a test to establish a baseline of their kicking abilities. After that, everyone returned to the gym once a week for 4 weeks to practice their kicking for 15 minutes. Every practice session was filmed, and the athletes were asked to rate how mentally effortful, physically effortful, and enjoyable their practice was. After 4 weeks of practice, everyone was tested again, and then 6 weeks after that, they came back for one final test to see whose improvements had actually stuck. Here are 5 of the most interesting differences they found. Finding number 1. Experts worked on their weaker areas. The intermediate group worked on their stronger areas. The expert athletes spent 66% of their time working on their weaker kick. The intermediate athletes spent only 27% of their time there, devoting most of their practice to what they already did pretty well. The result? Experts made significant gains on their weaker kick, going from about 14.5 points to nearly 20 points, and they retained that improvement 6 weeks later when they came back for the final test too. The intermediate group, on the other hand, did not improve their weaker kick at all. And while they did make significant improvements on their stronger kick, going from about 8 points to 15 points, they regressed on the final test. Finding number 2. Experts logged fewer repetitions, but worked harder on each one. The expert group and intermediate group spent the same amount of time practicing, but the expert athletes actually did fewer repetitions, averaging about 44 practice attempts in each session compared to 56 for the intermediate group. So the experts were doing less. How's that possible? Well, they rated their practice as being less enjoyable and requiring more mental and physical effort, which I think makes pretty good sense, because when we're working on our weaker areas, each repetition does take a little more out of us, so we naturally slow down, think more between attempts, and end up doing fewer of them overall. Finding number 3. Experts did more planning between repetitions. Based on recordings of what the athletes said out loud while they were practicing, the researchers found that experts did more thinking and planning before each practice attempt. On average, the experts verbalized almost twice as many thoughts per attempt than participants in the intermediate group. In particular, they made more monitoring and planning statements before each kick. In music terms, this would be the difference between mindlessly playing a passage over and over without stopping versus pausing between repetitions to reflect on what just happened and making a clear plan about what you're going to do differently on the next practice attempt. Finding number 4. Experts used more random practice. One of the more intriguing findings was that the expert group spent more than a quarter of their practice time doing what's known as random or interleaved practice, where they switched frequently between their different kicks. The intermediate group did barely any of this, spending most of their time practicing the same kick over and over. Most of us grow up doing that second approach, drilling one thing repeatedly before moving on to the next. It's called blocked practice, and it does work. However, if you've ever felt great about how something sounded at the end of a practice session, only to find the next day that much of it has disappeared overnight and you're kind of back to square 1 or 2 again, too much blocked practice might be the reason why. The main issue is that doing too many repetitions in a row leads to what's known as the illusion of mastery, where we think something is better learned than it really is, and it doesn't prepare us very well to play a passage correctly on the very first try. Interleaved practice, on the other hand, feels harder and slower in the moment, but the research on this is pretty consistent. Switching between different things forces deeper processing and helps us retain more of our improvements from one practice session to the next. Finding number 5, 3 outliers. You might be wondering, what would have happened if the less expert athletes had practiced more like the expert group? Well, as it turns out, 3 participants in the intermediate group actually did just that. Relative to the others in their group, they spent significantly more time working on their weaker kick, and just like the experts, they rated their practice sessions as less enjoyable and more effortful. And their test results reflected that. These 3 participants improved their weaker kick by an average of nearly 6 points compared to less than 1 point for the rest of the intermediate group. And they didn't sacrifice any gains on their stronger kick either. They improved on that as well. So how can we apply the findings of this study to music? Well, a few things. Thing number 1, take a moment to identify an aspect of your playing or passage that you feel least confident in, and plan to work on that first in your next practice session, not last when you're tired and out of time. Keep in mind that you do not have to perfect this passage or solve every issue completely before you move on. That would be too big of a task in some cases. The goal is simply to make it a tiny bit better. Call that a win for the day, and then continue to build on this progress over time. For more on the exact strategy professional artist level musicians use to practice difficult passages and make incremental progress, check out my conversation with Micah Killian. I'll link to that video in the description below. Thing number 2, slow down and give yourself time to think between repetitions. Before you play the passage again, stop. Reflect on what just happened. Decide exactly what adjustment you plan to make. Then test it out. Remember that what happens between repetitions matters as much as what happens during the repetition. Thing number 3, try switching between different treble spots during your practice sessions. If you drill the same passage over and over in isolation, it will eventually sound pretty good in that moment, but many of those improvements will not last overnight. For more durable skills, start mixing that passage in with other material, in the same way that you would shuffle between different vocabulary words or geometry formulas if you were preparing for a test and quizzing yourself with flashcards. None of this will feel easy, but that discomfort is actually a good sign. Remember that the expert athletes in the study rated their practice as less enjoyable, and they improved the most. As one of my teachers used to say, if practicing feels easy, you're probably doing it wrong. If you want to go deeper on building the practice habits that actually make skills stick, I put together a free email course called Pressure Proof. It's a week of essential practice strategies that helps you close the gap between how you play in the practice room and how you play on stage. The link to sign up is in the description.